such a range of projects in Waterloo and about sort of the future of Waterloo and London as a whole. So we'll get started in just a moment with Nick's presentation, but we'll just wait a sort of minute or two more for some more people to join. Hi everyone, so Nick, if you'd like to start now. Nick will be talking about some of our projects in Waterloo.
Right, good evening everyone. I'm Nick McGough, an Associate Partner at Weston Williamson and Partners. I'm delighted to be speaking about public space within our local Waterloo area. We're lucky enough to have our studio actually based sort of 3 minutes walk from Waterloo Station itself. And Waterloo Station has been the subject of a number of projects that we've been sort of very closely involved with, ranging from bringing the 5 platforms, the 5 old Eurostar platforms, back into use as domestic platforms, a project that opened a year ago now, together with working with LCR and others, looking at the retail opportunities below that former Eurostar terminal, and adjacent to Elizabeth House, which we'll hear from HB Heavis a little bit later. But really, I wanted to speak a little bit more generally about public space in London, and specifically in Waterloo. And I guess the obvious thing that's happened in Waterloo over the last couple of decades, really, is a bringing back of the celebration of the blue infrastructure, which we're lucky enough to have in this part of London, the river. Something that I think London for a long time turned its back onto, that really, I guess since the turn of the millennium, has seen a real sort of resurgence. And the character of the South Bank, which has always been sort of one of sort of rebellion and counterculture, and sort of, you know, looking towards the Houses of Parliament on the other side and sort of shaking its fist and saying, no, we're different, we're anti-establishment, and imbuing its identity from a whole host of cultural institutions, from the BFI, the Hayworth Gallery, a bit further down the South Bank, the Tate. And I guess the sort of the public space I sort of want us to be aware of is that sort of blue infrastructure, the Thames itself. It's a very sort of different public space, because it's not necessarily a public space that you can walk on or use in terms of the surface, but what it does is it gives you views across the city, views through the cities, and space and vistas. And I think that's something that's so important to how we use public spaces and the identity of cities all over the world. I think you know, London's identity is, you know, the Thames is something that you couldn't possibly sort of ignore as part of London's identity. And I think that the South Bank, in terms of what it brings as a public space, as a promenade, as a series of cultural institutions and moments along a route, is something that I think we're incredibly privileged to have in this area. And I think what we're going to hear from now from a number of speakers are very specific projects that sort of build on what's been happening in the Waterloo area over the last decades, and actually I think really show all of us that there's an incredibly sort of bright future ahead for the area. And I know we're all sort of you know, somewhat perhaps pessimistic following the recent news that we're going to have to be facing a lockdown for a little bit longer. But that's not to say that our public spaces you know, won't continue to thrive, and if anything become even more important. So with that, I'll hand over to the next speaker.
So thank you for that, Nick. On that note, we've got Gazine joining us this evening, and she'll be talking about the TfL Streetscape programme and also what that means for Waterloo.
Yeah, hi, good evening. Thanks for inviting me for this event. And yeah, I will speak a bit about the street space program. So my background, I'm an urban designer with TfL since a number of years now. And street space program was born out of the DFT's announcement to make more space for walking and cycling and social distancing back in May in a response of COVID. And TfL responded to this in setting up the street space program, which is effectively a program which helps, what distributes funding, but helps and guides local authorities to actually put the ambitions into practice of enabling more walking and cycling in response to COVID and sort of coordinating this response. One of our key focuses around it were initially it was obviously the just providing more space for pedestrians and for social distancing, but also to create these more strategic cycling network routes so people do not have to rely on using the tube but can use a bike instead. And also as part of this is a focus on low traffic neighborhoods, which is in a way is sort of looking again at how we move in the city and looking at really localized movement on how do you access the high street by foot or by bike or your school. So short journeys which happen in the more residential areas through the low traffic neighborhoods, and then the strategic movement corridors to get further distances by bike. For Waterloo, it's an interesting aspect because Waterloo is in a way is different to many other areas of London, which as its public realm functions and its movement function, it is heavily an area which was heavily used by commuters. It was this cultural powerhouse, internationally recognized, and all of these elements have suddenly fallen away. But I think the opportunity for Waterloo was that suddenly with this main hub happening is that the softer sides or the quieter sides of Waterloo begin to shine. They are actually residential areas, they are smaller streets, and we start experiencing that space from a different, in a different way. I think with COVID and street space, there are some real opportunities in there for Waterloo, because we will be looking at some finer grains of public realm and the quieter spaces, and you actually have the ability to look up because this whole noise of traffic and people is slightly taken away. However, I can also see risks for the area because we perceive it as this international hub, and it will have to sort of redefine itself again in a way. I think street space can help with this because it looks at how do we get more people on public transport, taking some of the traffic pressure away, and also looking on this sort of more long-term and green recovery as well. So how can we, by gaining new space, for example, through the social distancing measures, introduce additional green spaces, pocket parks, making space for people instead of car, and carrying that through to the future. So yeah, these are sort of, that's my contribution, I think. And yeah, hand over.
Thank you for that. And I cycle into Waterloo on the CS7 cycle superhighway, and it's been great sort of seeing through the streetscape project on that, one of the kind of main routes, how space has been redistributed for cycling and towards pedestrians, and how much has happened in such a short space of time as well. Picking up on one of the points on Abby's master plan, we've got David talking about the Elizabeth House project. And for anyone that doesn't know, Elizabeth House is a real key site sort of on the corner of Waterloo Station, and it's going to play a big part in the future of Waterloo.
Hi everyone. If I think I've managed to request control of this.
Yeah.
Let me see whether I can actually move the dial. Yes, so redevelopment of Elizabeth House occupies, as we've just said, a key site adjacent to Waterloo. It's the UK's busiest station, obviously, with and we're 5 minutes walk to the to Westminster, and also in and around the South Bank. It's always been a site of strategic importance to London, to Lambeth, and we're aiming to provide high quality mixed-use building that's going to positively contribute to the immediate and the wider context. Now, just to give you some specs on it, we're looking at 1.2 million square foot of workspace. We're looking for WELL, Wired Platinum, BREEAM Outstanding, supporting a diverse ecosystem of businesses and creating space for approximately 11,000 new jobs. Given the scale of this scheme, 3 minutes is a really tough ask to describe the development. So I'm going to focus on the public realm around the area. But if you want to hear anything more about the building, I can talk it to death. So please contact me after to talk more. If we focus on the public spaces, in its current state, the public realm directly around Waterloo Station is pretty cluttered. It's not particularly pleasant, and the routes are blocked by our existing Elizabeth House. That's the disconnect that actually Abby just spoke about. It's not really befitting of UK's busiest train station, especially given the improvements and the excellent facilities and the spine route connecting to the South Bank. So we hope to change this area with the creation of 2 big public squares, one of which is Victory Arch Square outside the main entrance. It enables step-free access from the South Bank to Waterloo Station and improves the setting of this sort of grade 2 listed arch that's at the front that I'm sure many of you all recognise. We also create another large square in Waterloo Square, breaking up what the existing building currently covers this area. It'd be a ground floor public space along York Road. It would have 4 stories up to the ceiling, as I'm going to show you in a bit. It's the new connection in the scheme. It's the new access way into LCR's Waterloo.retail space. We also create, connecting these two, the Curve, a new pedestrianised street that runs between Elizabeth House and the former Waterloo International Terminal. And that's to be aligned with shops and cafes. So I'm going to give you a few visuals as we go through here. But the effectively, and actually the fourth space, which is fairly unique to the development activity that's been going on in this area, is a promenade deck that's elevated 2 stories above. So it is effectively level with the concourse. On this side, you can see the Waterloo International Terminal where you'd get off the train. We'd be creating this large acre of green space to which our main entrances to the new offices above are located. If I click through onto some of the visuals, so you can see this is our main lobby space and a view through the building effectively. So you're 4 stories off the ground before you get to this. I'll go through the visuals on the curve. So this is the Waterloo Curve. It'd be a new space that mirrors the shape of Waterloo International Terminal. It's lined with shops and cafes, runs between the new development and Waterloo Station. It's currently an area of disused space or car parking, and we want to make that an attractive new route, free from traffic, connecting Lower Marsh and Leek Street to the south to our new Victory Arch Square to the north. Now we obviously work with HMM on this scheme, and we also brought in a company called the Place Bureau to set the public realm strategy and 4 key principles we've been abiding by. One is hyper natural. We want a generous design that regenerates us all. We want some green space in there. Always alive. It's a place that's in pace. It's forever in motion. Again, with that accessibility. Elegantly offbeat. It's a bit more unconventional. Adds to distinction, which is typical of the South Bank. And also, I think particularly important currently is wholesome life. A place that optimizes us by optimizing the time. So the way we one of the points that is brought up in every talk we do at the moment is the COVID-19 pandemic. I think these principles, whilst we developed them before the start of this year, I think they're critical to the way we think about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the future of workspace. There are really obvious benefits to working from the office, and I believe it's a fundamental driver. The fundamental driver will be a multifactorial one. What makes me want to leave the house and go to the office? And I think public realm has a huge impact on this decision process for anyone. You need to feel safe, secure, and that the space is sustainable. It needs to be designed to maximize interactions and collaboration. We need to create moments of interest and experience that you can't get at home. And we need to be easily accessible from transportation and simple connections going from home to desk that optimizes your time. I think it also plays into one of the other themes that was the subject of this talk, this idea of civic and local in terms of space. So we fundamentally designed the project to try and develop the public realm first and then the building beyond. So we're creating civic spaces that are large, they're open, they're filled with green visual amenity. They draw people into each activity. And and they provide access to the South Bank and leverage our surrounding benefits. And also, as we kind of continue to develop the scheme, we're trying to link into the other plans in the area that Lambeth are developing, Network Rail are developing, Transport for London are developing, and making sure that we're working with these key stakeholders to provide a seamless experience in this realm. It's pretty much all got to knit together and build the whole experience for the area. So that's me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. As I'm sure anyone that uses Waterloo will know, that's such a congested space by the front of the existing Elizabeth House, and when you come out those Victory Arch steps. So this new public realm is really going to change that space and the experience for anyone using the station. And it's also great to see that elevation of the former international terminal, sort of that elevation that we never really see at the moment, because as you mentioned, it's tucked away, and it's really going to change how we use and think about the station and how we permeate the station when this project's complete. Which brings us on to Rebecca's going to be talking from Network Rail about researching and master planning for user experience in stations, and some work they're doing on ideas that can improve our experience as we use stations.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. So I work in our property department on major developments that are socially useful rather than purely profitable. And I hope to surprise you a little bit this evening, because listening to Abby saying the word brand and Gazine and David saying the word experience, I want to talk about those things rather than what's quite typical for Network Rail. I was talking about capacity and numbers of passengers and all fitting into trying to expand our big box station to fit more people in. Actually, very often we end up with a master plan for a station that really wants to be a destination. Waterloo is already that in its own right, of course, everyone's already said that. But a destination is just a word if it's a function, if it's a station on its own, rather than an experience. And as David said, something that draws people there, where they want to stay, where they can have fun, where they can enjoy themselves, where it's socially useful. And I think in that respect, we started work on another station which has that blue infrastructure, which has that rebel culture, that's Leeds. And I think there are some really strong parallels to where they want to be a destination, and they've got all the pieces that could make it great. But at the moment, it is just a station, and none of the potential is really tapped. So we've spent some time looking at the station as a campus, in the same way that you might imagine a university as a campus, different spaces that need to connect together and be porous, so that people don't think of it as a station that I have to exit in order to get somewhere else. And that has a rich mix of stuff going on, reasons for me to stay. And there's a lot of catalytic cost to get that stuff to work. So one of the things that we often struggle with big infrastructure is telling everybody, frankly, to wait until it's delivered. So you're living through a construction site for 5-10 years, and when it's done, it'll be great. But who thinks of a brand, using Abby's word, who can think of a brand where you would keep on buying that product for years and years and years, waiting for it to become great? You'd just go elsewhere. And whilst when we're talking about passengers, you don't often have the choice of which station you come into if you're commuting, or which station you use, it would be nice to think that people wanted to use it, not just had to use it. And so thinking from a brand perspective, during that construction period, not just at the very end with this glamorous master plan that we're all aiming for, but throughout, all the way from beginning now, like Gazim was saying, the experience from now in redefining space ought to be from an always meanwhile perspective. So thinking of our station and the spaces around it and our public realm and outdoors as not an end product, but an inherently flexible one that moves with the construction, one that tests out and incubates ideas, that is small and brave in its beginning, but that evolves so that the neighborhood and the users genuinely enjoy the experience of change and the experience that they get whilst they're in this area, not just sit and wait for our station to be good enough for you, please.
Thanks, Rebecca. And it's really exciting to hear that these are the things that Network Rail are thinking about at the moment. And it feels incredibly timely as well, what with the sort of change that's happening at the moment and really changing how we think about stations and when will we use stations, do we need to use them every day? And this is really kind of making that case for why they're important to us and communities. Next, we've got Alex talking about We Are Waterloo and their role around Waterloo and some of the projects they're involved in.
Hi everyone, I'm going to do the obligatory, can everyone hear me? I can see some faces, so if you can give me a nod. Perfect, yeah. Thank you. So my name's Alex, I work for We Are Waterloo, it's the Business Improvement District of Waterloo. We see ourselves sort of as the rebellious younger brother of the South Bank. I know the word rebel has been thrown around a little bit, but that's sort of the identity that we have. Having said that, I'm going to talk through a couple of the greening projects that we've done, which may not necessarily be particularly rebellious. But in light of kind of current circumstances, I think greening and the role that it has to play within Waterloo has become particularly important. So in terms of the sort of makeup of Waterloo, we currently have about 75% of residents who don't have access to outdoor green space. So as a bid, we are in quite a nice place to be able to provide that, not only to support the residents but, and the businesses, but the entire community as well. So I've tried to condense some of the things that we've done over the last sort of year on 2 slides, which was a challenge. But the first one is the left-hand side that you see there, which is the Second Street Pocket Park. Now this was a depaving project, so we took away a lot of kind of hard concrete and replaced it with greenery. This is on a quiet side street, which is Second Street, just off of Cornwall Road, and this was after a successful grant application to the Greener Cities Fund, which forms part of a larger project we're trying to push along with SOAN, the local residents association, South Bank and Waterloo Neighbours, which is to highlight the clean air walking routes throughout Waterloo. Cornwall Road in particular is identified as a greenway, and so to have this nice little bit of greenery there does sort of promote that. So we've done kind of other little bits and pieces alongside that, including other planters and murals. But for Second Street, we initiated quite a large community planting day. And we had about 50 or so participants, local residents, local businesses, and the local nursery, which is just opposite, and you'll see a couple of the children there planting. And we also, just in the top left photo, were highlighted in the Mayor's Grey to Green guide in terms of sort of best practice of depaving. So quite a nice little project. Would advise that you walk past if you can. To the right of that, we've got Edible Marsh. As a bid, we run Lower Marsh Market, and as part of that, we initiated a project to provide edible produce on the market itself. So we have 7 large planters, we have 4 wheelbarrows, we have 2 tappy stalls, which are really old kind of market carts, which we repurposed into vegetable gardens. And we have a huge variety of sort of edible foods, edible plants and herbs, etc. During COVID, it's been sort of something that we've encouraged people to go and access, especially the local residents. We normally would run kind of workshops to sort of local workers under the umbrella of kind of reclaim your work hour, get out of the office, do a bit of planting, etc. But whilst that's not been possible, we have really kind of pushed to try and get local residents to take a little bit of ownership of the planters. And as you can see from some of the photos, they look pretty good. So we're quite happy with that. If we move on to the next slides, please. We have got on the left, which isn't specifically kind of a greening project itself, but we've got the Lower Marsh Time closure, which is something the bid was instrumental in putting kind of through. So Lower Marsh was regenerated in 2012 with what I understand is the ultimate ambition to kind of pedestrianise the street with that kind of shared surface that you see there. Despite that, it's been open to traffic up until COVID hit. This time last year, we would see 4,000 people, 4,000 journeys rather, in and out of Lower Marsh at peak footfall hours. But by contrast, we would see one car every 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes. So in terms of that usage of space, there is an overwhelming desire for pedestrian usage, and yet cars were prioritised. So when COVID did hit, there was obviously a need for social distancing. So we worked very closely with Lambeth Council to implement a scheme which was very sort of respectful of the needs of residents to access Lower Marsh, and yet still allowed businesses to thrive during lunchtime and during the evenings. We as the bid man the entry points, we facilitate access, and just make sure that the time closure runs smoothly. It's been vital for local businesses, and we're currently at a point where we are roughly 70% of footfall of what we would have seen last year under non-COVID circumstances, which for us is quite reassuring. And in terms of the evenings as well, we've sort of supported the implementation of pavement licenses, which have been also very supportive of kind of local pubs, restaurants and cafes, etc. We closed the road during that period too. It allows plenty of outdoor space, and is something that is ongoing for perhaps, well, we have the ability to do it for the next year or so. Finally, Bayliss Road, and I don't want to touch on this too much because I know Anna is speaking after me, and this is a project which she designed entirely and has been excellent working with throughout. The one thing that I would like to highlight is that the residents within this sort of section of Bayliss Road, so from 22 to 29, and then again to the right hand side there's some more units, they don't have access to any green space directly. They do have Millennium Green near them, but this is kind of on their doorstep, and we've worked really closely with them on this project so that they can adopt some of the 39 planters that Anna has designed. We worked with solely local architects, carpenters, gardeners and businesses to be able to deliver this. And it's a nice little bit of transformation from a piece of road that was kind of sort of hidden between a lot of pavement to a really nice green space. So on that point, I will leave it and Anna can fill in some of the details.
That's great to hear about your projects, Alex. And I'm very familiar with your Second Street Pocket Park, but I didn't know the details behind it. You know, as anyone who's familiar with any of these projects will know the sort of impact they've got when you go past and experience them. You know, they all make a real positive contribution. And on that note, Anna's now going to talk about Bayliss Road.
Hi, thanks Max, thanks Alex as well. Sorry, I've started at the end. Let's go. So yeah, I'm going to speak about the Bayliss Road Pocket Garden a little bit more. So for those of you who don't know the site, it's a couple of minutes from Waterloo Station. It's also about 5 minutes from the Weston Williamson and Partners office. And that black line on the screen indicates my old walk to work. So I was quite lucky to be relatively familiar with the site prior to the competition. A little bit more about the site itself. It's adjacent to the Duke of Sussex pub and the pub garden. So one of the key considerations for the project was that it couldn't be an extension of the pub garden. So there had to be some kind of barrier there. There's also quite a large tree which is shading about 50% of the site. And there's also quite a steep gradient to deal with. So this is my submission, which I'm very thankful for We Are Waterloo for selecting. It was a series of timber planters which worked their way up in scale towards the back of the site to create that divide between the garden and the pub garden, but also to maximise sunlight. This is the garden in plan. So I integrated a path to allow people to engage a little bit more closely with the garden to hopefully provide a slight improvement to people's mundane walks to work or walks to the shops. We tried to select plants which would work throughout the year. It was originally planned to be built at the beginning of the summer, so because of COVID-19, it was built a lot later in September, so the local gardener Francis did an incredible job adapting the planting schedule to suit. I won't go into the design development in too much detail, but one of the most interesting conversations we had was whether we were going to build it as 2 large single bespoke units or whether we were going to divide it into modular units. So the benefit of the single bespoke units was that they were very large, people wouldn't be able to pick them up, so it was a bit safer. It used less wood, and also I think it provided a more interesting outcome. The modular units, on the other hand, were kind of easier to manufacture. They could be built off-site. So this whole conversation basically boiled down to, with COVID-19 restrictions, whether Darren, the carpenter, would be able to build this on site. So once we got the go-ahead that he would, we decided to go ahead with the 2 single units. It's just some more photos from the construction. Unfortunately, I wasn't actually in London for the majority of this, but I was in constant conversation with Darren through photos and drawings and lots of phone calls to make sure everything was going to plan. And I think, as you can see, he's done an incredible job at navigating the very complex angles which I designed into the scheme. This is the Community Planting Day, which we at Waterloo organised, which I think was a really successful event. It was really nice to see people from local businesses come down and join in. So I think there's plans, Alex will hopefully be able to confirm this, for another planting day for the second half of the garden a bit later this year. So unfortunately I've just moved to Sheffield, so I won't be able to attend, but I'm looking forward to seeing photos from that. And yeah, that's me, thank you.
Thanks, Anna, and that's great to hear how the project's gone ahead and adapted sort of over the last few months due to COVID. Just wanted to say thank you to all of our speakers. That's given such a great overview of the developments that are happening in Waterloo across all scales, from big to small. And it's really exciting to hear about all the projects that are coming online and how they're also adapting to current conditions. We're now going to move into some questions and answers, which my colleague Carlotta is going to jump in and lead.
Thank you so much for all the presentations, really, really interesting. So we have a question from Ted Inman, the chair of the Jubilee Garden Trust, and this is specifically for Abby, if she's still on the call.
I am.
So Ted basically just noted that the list that you presented did not contain 2 of the kind of key green space projects. So the extension of the Jubilee Gardens, which would be a unique opportunity for adding 60 hectares of green open space in central London, as well as the re-landscaping of Burnley Spain Gardens north, offering a new biodiverse oasis in a dense urban area. Yeah, just wondering if you kind of had any comment on those projects, or if you were kind of aware of them, and yeah, how they fit into the kind of wider strategy that you presented.
Yeah, I think that's a fair observation. I guess the schemes that were kind of picked out within the diagram are largely kind of, I guess, true hardcore built environment schemes, and perhaps it's kind of a bit of an oversight not to have included those, because I think as we've all kind of touched on, or a lot of people have touched on today during the discussion, the importance of green space, particularly through the pandemic, has been kind of even more relevant, and I think Ted makes a valid point that they should be noted for sure.
Great, thank you very much. Then there's a question about the land ownership, which Leighton Pace from Exterior Architecture has asked. So this is kind of anyone from the panel could answer this really, but because I think a lot of the projects actually touch on this complexity. So with the complexity of land ownership being an issue in delivering joined up and coherent public realm, what mechanisms do the panel think might shortcut complex agreements between multiple stakeholders? I don't know if anyone wants to jump in, or otherwise I'll just pick on someone. Yeah, David?
As someone who spends most of his time doing complex agreements with multiple landowners, I really don't know. I think that the best thing is, the best way forward I've always had is for it to be design led. So the stronger and easier the actual agreements are is to do with the strength of the design and the fact that you've got all the stakeholders to buy into it. When we're dealing with Network Rail, Transport for London, Lambeth, all at the same time, It's about focusing on getting the design, getting their input into the design, getting everybody happy and bought into what we're doing, and then going on to the legal agreements. And those become much easier when you've got a strong story and a strong narrative and a strong consultation process.
Yeah, and I guess to kind of follow in on that as well, I guess that the kind of community involvement would also be, because we've looked at kind of projects across different scales, I imagine that how much community involvement there is on all these different projects is also kind of key in delivering them.
That question as well, Alex, what's your view and kind of experience of dealing with the community and different landowners, being at sort of the opposite end of the scale where you're working on sort of quite small, nimble projects often?
It just, depends who's willing to take the largest bribe, really. No, I think that our projects kind of are quite nice in that they do involve the community. I mean, the amount of people that we managed to involve within Bayliss Road, the garden that Anna's designed, it's a huge amount, and we engaged quite early, despite COVID, with Lambeth, with the owners of the accommodation opposite, with the pub. So I think it's just about making sure that the project kind of fits for all, taking on board that feedback and just making sure that I think there have been some instances where there has been quite a big sort of opposition to a certain thing, referencing, I suppose, the timed closure. And equally, what we've done there is that we've put in place mechanisms that do support people that don't necessarily that weren't on board. So by having that kind of marshalling system, by having the access window through the middle of the day, by having sort of concessions for residents and other users of the streets, we've managed to make that kind of project work. And that's a shared space. So I think just listening and being confident that you're doing your absolute most to support people is vital.
Can I add? I mean, I may have misinterpreted the question a bit, but I don't think you can not have those agreements. You can't shortcut them. You have to have, between landowners, you have to have some quite complicated agreements in place. What makes them easier to start and easier to push through, no matter the complexities of them, is, David said design. I think it goes a step before that. I think it's having an aligned set of objectives. So if your vision as a group, as a stakeholder group, is aligned to a social purpose that everyone loves, no one can dislike something that's going to genuinely add social value to an area. Once you've got that, then it's quite easy to escalate when stuff gets stuck, and all come back to a joint form of governance. And that's how it's working incredibly well at Leeds, where a joint governance structure, which is largely voluntary between all the different stakeholders and landowners, that's where you end up bringing the problems that are slowing stuff down, so that they don't slow stuff down for very long. But you're never going to avoid the complexity, ever. You just have to have some sort of something that you all hold dear, I think.
Yeah, thanks very much. Nick had a question for David, which I'll let him ask directly.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked quite a bit about the green and blue infrastructure in the Waterloo area, sort of past, present, and future, which I think is hugely exciting. I just wanted to pick up on the fact, obviously, the Shell Centre has now gone up with a huge amount of residential units, imbuing further increasing the community within Waterloo. A stone's throw away from the Elizabeth House scheme. And I wanted to understand a little bit more about, I guess, David, how you're thinking that sort of post-pandemic office demand sort of may or may not change how we think about office space in the sort of, medium to longer term. So not the kind of immediate, next 6 months working from home, but actually in the longer term view. And I think you touched a little bit on that when you were talking.
Yeah, I mean, it's the big question at the moment. I suppose the way we've come at it, we've had huge amount of discussions about the space that we've got, and I think we're incredibly lucky with the Elizabeth House project, just because we can act at a slightly different scale to other developments. I think response to the sort of longer term response to the kind of pandemic generally will be that flexibility, that space that you can move around, that you can have the different spacing requirements, that you can get touchless through your from your home to your desk. Things like that can only be done whenever you've got that inherent flexibility within the design, and also leveraging outdoor space. Now, one of the things I didn't talk about in our development, it got cut at the last minute, is we've got some very, very large private terrace spaces as part of the development on the various roofs as the building steps up. And I think those are going to be integral to the way we fit out and think about the office space and the tenants that are going to come into that, because they're going to want to access outside space, not just as an amenity as we use it now, but also as a way of actually operating their business, having outside meetings, having sort of their town hall might not be in an inside lobby in the way it is now. It might be in an outside open green space. And again, we've got the massive benefit of scale to be able to do that. I think then once we get beyond that, we'll need to start thinking about much more into the minutiae and getting that detailed design correct. That because it can be small, door handle details or small little things that will really impact everybody's day and everybody's ability to work through the space. So I think at the moment we're in the luxury of finishing concept design, and once we get into fit out and things like that, we'll be answering the sort of next level of challenging questions.
Great, thank you. Ted also just messaged in to say that it's important to note that almost all the public space between York Road, Stamford Street and the river is privately owned, which, yeah, is quite interesting just to kind of think about ownership, as well as also in response about the kind of office use, as people kind of maybe start to have meetings outside and maybe not kind of meeting in the office space. That idea of ownership, I guess, as well, of who can use those spaces and how they're used and how they're left behind.
I think just picking up on that point, it's really interesting that that's just been highlighted, because it's actually not obvious. And I think that's actually a wonderful thing, because there are certain, I think they're called POPs, aren't they? Privately owned public spaces, where you actually very much feel that they're privately owned. Yeah. And, quite often, and I'm thinking probably more in the square mile than in Waterloo, but where they're actively policed with a private security force, and they look incredibly manicured, wonderful, beautifully planted and landscaped spaces that people are to look and not touch. And you kind of think, well, actually, in terms of the civic contribution that those public spaces can make to cities, is that really what we want, and is that what we want to encourage? And again, it comes back to that really interesting conversation that I think Rebecca was highlighting, sort of together with others, around this idea of agreements between landowners, governance, state, how these decisions are made, how these spaces will be operated, and actually ultimately the social and economic and well-being benefits that they can bring.
That's where I would say, especially with third parties, you have to have some element that is commercially astute. You can't just go for it's socially great, so why don't you just do it? There aren't that many private landowners who are going to follow that particular narrative really closely. So a lot of our investment at Network Rail has to be something we demonstrate as not just coping with passenger numbers and capacity, but as something that will grow income in order to fund the railway. And it's that sort of logic where you're funding something that will be commercially successful, that translates quite well when we work with third parties, so private landlords who otherwise just wouldn't engage very well.
And if it's done right, it's win-win. That's the bottom line, isn't it?
I just say it ties all the questions together, actually, that one, for when describing our development, because of the spaces that I showed you around the building, one Victory Arch Square will be land ownership, will be hopefully a contiguous space that you won't notice that the land ownership will be combined between Network Rail and HB Heavis. The curve will be similar, only with Secretary of State and LCR. So there'll be sort of half private, half, well, privately held but public organisations that will operate them. And we very much don't want it to feel like a manicured separate private space. It's meant to be for the way everyone uses space, and we think that adds huge value to our development. But at the same time, it has a social good. So I think we see both sides to add value to the scheme.
Great. I have a question from Phil Breeze, the managing partner at Weston Williamson. So aside from your own work, what developer-led public open spaces do the panel regard as the most successful examples in London at the moment? Might need to give everyone a bit of time to think about it.
Is it cheating if I say Jubilee Gardens because there's someone from Jubilee Gardens Trust on the line?
The forefront of your mind.
I mean, a space that I think, and funnily enough, also to some extent, or to quite some extent, infrastructure-led, that has been developed over the last, the last good few years, is Granary Square, which we've seen, really bring a sort of disused part of London, somewhat unpleasant only a sort of a decade ago, into real kind of public focus as a place where you see kids take their first steps, as people enjoy sort of the dynamism of the water fountains there, and all surrounded and enabled by the infrastructure and the old meeting the new. And I think these sorts of spaces, I think we're quite lucky in London actually that we're having a sort of, I'd almost go as far as to say, a renaissance of the public space. And if there's anything that we can do to sort of take away some positive out of the challenge we're facing right now with the pandemic, it's to reinforce that thinking, and actually to take that away as something that that refocuses our sort of efforts in sort of in greening the city, in taking advantage of the green and the blue networks, in opening spaces up, and in sort of regenerating spaces. And I think the answer or the sort of the example that came to my mind from Phil's question there was very much Granary Square. I'm not saying it's the it's the best example. It's just the first one that came to my head on a sort of off the cuff question.
Yeah, great. We also have a question from Abby Lennox from Tideway. So what does the panel envisage will be the future funding sources for public realm and greening schemes during and post-COVID? And who maintains the community gardens, how to get and sustain buy-in, since good maintenance is essential for enduring impact?
Great question. That's one we often struggle with, is how you fund these things. So getting the first, that catalyst of getting stuff, bringing people in and making them use the space differently, that needs funding before anyone actually sees any real commercial value in setting up a business in the area, which keeps it going, or bringing in, becoming sponsors or advertisers in a space. I'm quite lucky in that I have a budget that does that first upfront cost. And once you've got someone present, then, as I say, getting in a sponsor or a brand or a local business that wants to be known and associated with a vibrant space, that's much easier. But you've got to put in that upfront budget. And I only have that for another 3.5 years. But yeah, I don't know how you deal with it when you don't have that first oomph, really.
I would just add, I guess this is where the planning kind of process really comes into its own in some regard, and it kind of talks to a requirement for a strong, I guess, negotiation process on the local authority's perspective. But it's a two-way kind of process, isn't it? Working with the developer to secure those contributions, and I guess supporting that, making sure that we have quite a clear pipeline of projects that are related to the development and pass all the relevant tests, but can provide that, I guess, the seed funding in the first instance, and to provide some form of improvement to public space. But I think you're right in terms of you know, the question of it's all right getting something in for the first couple of years, but then maintaining it going onwards is it's really challenging, and everyone has relatively shrinking budgets, so it's you know, something that we really need to give due consideration to, really.
And if you just reflect back on Nick's point about Granary Square and how successful that is, 2 or 3 years ago, all of that energy was around King's Cross St Pancras, because that was the new stuff. And then the reason the energy is transferred north to Granary Square is because that's where the first initial, like that initial investment's gone to make people want to walk up there, to make people want to explore it, to have fun in that space. And as soon as that dies away, you're relying on the infrastructure that was put in that's permanent. So the fountains, they're permanent. They're not going to go anywhere. You're just relying on the maintenance cost for the owner. It's quite easy to do, but you've got the same problem then of long term, who keeps that going? And from a station perspective, what I'd really love to push for is that our station operations teams add in effectively a host, like almost like an event manager who keeps the energy alive of encouraging pop-up events, and that, even if it's just tech driven, so you're relying on social media to create that event, all of that energy disappears if you lose the person who's there to trigger it. That's what's happened at King's Cross, it's what's happened at Stratford, because it just transfers away to the next new thing. And that's a bit sad. And I think that goes to your point, Abby, about a 2012 master plan that's now, I mean, it's out of date for many reasons, but it's also just, it's lost an energy because there's no one there keeping it alive every day. And there's a small operating cost in having one person who is a host, an events manager for a space.
Yeah. I think with funding, it's sort of looking at public realm is taking a layered approach. One of the key elements is long-term ownership and being custodian of a public realm, and that applies to, say, public organizations like TfL, but also landowners. And taking the long-term view and setting the basis for long-term funding basis is absolutely essential. And I think for TfL it's obvious that the current funding model has fallen apart since we have the fair revenue loss, and TfL needs to get an agreement with the DfT on a much more long-term funding proposal that then can make big substantial moves in the public realm that can carry it for a long time. And then there's sort of then the interim and small scale layer of fundings, which, as Rebecca pointed out, you need this little push, you need some seed funding to keep things going. And there will be a constant turnover of small projects coming up, dying down again. And if you're thinking public realm sort of as a living organism, which has its little seasons, but has sort of its big ages as well. And that's how funding streams must adjust to it. I'm a bit nervous in the future if we're heading into recession, how much private contributions can sustain small-scale interventions, how delightful they are. That we might go into a season of more drought around that front, so we have to ensure that the projects that do get funding are done well and get the greatest impact. I think that's something to focus on.
Great. So yeah, I think and Ted made another comment about the ownership, actually, that the South Bank spaces are not actually typical privately owned public spaces, such as Jubilee Gardens are actually owned by a local charity, and Bernie Spain Gardens are owned by Coin Street Social Enterprise. And I think that does kind of come back again to even kind of Granary Square is privately owned, and that kind of idea of maintenance as well, that maybe that kind of ownership is important for maintenance and kind of keeping that energy, like Rebecca said as well. I'm just going to kind of start wrapping up the questions now. I think I might have got one more. So from another one from Annie Lennox actually was about funding sources. So what funding sources does the panel envisage for public realm enhancements and community initiatives? If anyone wants to jump in.
I'll jump in. I think I think you have to make the most of the partners around you. Like, as we've said, there's not going to be a huge amount of funding available. It's about being really tactical and sort of magpie-ish and jumping on any opportunity. So I'll bring it back to sort of Bayliss Road. There was not a pot of funding available there for that kind of intervention, as small as it may be. It was a suggestion in a walk around session, but Lambeth obviously have a significantly, hugely higher budget than we do at We Are Waterloo, and for us to be able to tap into that for that intervention makes perfect sense. So we put forward a small proposal. In terms of the benefit to Lambeth, it was great. In terms of like what we can do, we can deliver it on the ground, we can involve the community, etc. And it worked really well. But prior to that sort of walk around, there's no specific opportunity. So those kind of smaller scale interventions, it's just about jumping on any opportunity that you can find. As quite a nimble sort of bid, a nimble kind of organisation, that's the sort of stuff that we tend to do. Appreciate it is not applicable to many other people within the panel.
Great. Don't know if anyone wanted to add anything else.
I'm sure you'll appreciate the opposite end of the spectrum. So we apply to DFT through a really lengthy process of funding. That's for large infrastructure change. So that's enhancements and renewals. And wherever we apply, all the applications have to have a commercial case that show we have maximised the amount of private sector funds that go into a scheme. So, and that's my role really, is to build the business case so that we minimise the taxpayer burden. And it might not be a short-term minimise, it might be in the longer term we can project income streams that minimise the maintenance costs and so on. But it's effectively our first source is the Treasury, and we just have to try and work to reduce that short-term and long-term revenue stream-wise.
Great. Yeah, I think that concludes the Q&A. Thank you so much, everyone. Don't know if Max, if you wanted to wrap anything up.
Yeah, I just want to say again, thank you for everyone that's spoken this evening, and it's been so interesting to hear everything that's been shared. And thanks as well for the questions that have been sent in. We've had some great questions there, and that's been a really fascinating discussion.